It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Sandra Jones, formerly of the Center for Health and Social Research. So, yes, Health and Social Research within the McKillop, and now the Pro Vice Chancellor for Engagement at ACU. Many of us actually have worked with Sandra previously, and she's here to tell you all how your research can have impact and become more meaningful, even if Emma says that meaningfulness is not important.
It's a good outcome. It's a good outcome.
But no, Sandra's here to tell us all about engagement, impact, what it means, and how we can all do it a little bit better.
Thank you.
And Charlotte's in my seat.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Chris. I'm not sure I'm going to tell you how to do it better. Okay. I'm going to tell you how the ARC would like us to do it. There's lots of different ways of interpreting what we mean by engagement and what we mean by impact, and this is very much around what is it we're actually being assessed on by the ARC. So people are probably aware that EI is a companion exercise to ERA, so we're all very familiar with ERA. It's been driving our lives as researchers for quite some time, and that this is a parallel exercise which currently runs at roughly the same time, so it's assessed in the same year. Submissions go in a couple of months after the ERA submission, assuming it stays the same. And a lot of the data that's submitted for ERA actually then feeds straight into the EI process as well. So it means that a lot of the decisions around what we're going to submit and how we're going to submit are predetermined by the ERA data, particularly in terms of things like thresholds. So the purpose of the process is to really enable the ARC to assess what are universities doing to actually drive engagement with end users, what are they doing to ensure that research has impact, what are institutions doing, and how are we actually doing research that helps the community. So very much about being able to say to the general public, all of this taxpayer money goes into funding research at universities. How does Australia actually benefit from this as a community? And obviously, like all of these exercises, it's designed to drive behaviour. So, we know that what we're rewarded for as universities we'll do more of. So it's really about recognising what we're currently doing to support that to happen, but also encouraging us to do a lot more of it. And the focus is very much on the institutional context. So unlike ERA, where your outputs follow you, so if you leave this university, you go work somewhere else, as long as you go before the census date, they then claim the publications that go with that researcher. This process is very much based around the actual institution itself, so where the research happened and where the support for impact happened. That'll kind of make more sense as we go through it. There was a pilot in 2017, which was a very limited pilot. They tested a small number of codes and it was optional, although most universities did participate. We didn't get a lot of feedback on the process or on the outcomes, but then there was the 2018 submission, which we recently completed, and you would have seen the outcomes, but I'm going to show them to you in a minute anyway because I'm quite proud of them. And then the next submission will be 2021. So when I talk about things like the dates and the reference periods, this is as we currently understand it. So what we were told in the 2018 submission was this would happen every 3 years following the same sort of timelines and the same sort of processes. So there's not an absolute guarantee that won't change, and I know there's been a lot of conversations about could ERA be every 5 years instead of every 3 years, and we would assume that if that happened, the same thing would happen with this process.
How likely is it that this is going to be maintained? Because we've heard rumours that it's going to get dropped.
Prior to the election, we heard lots of those rumours,
yeah.
and I think it probably was a real possibility that it was going to get dropped. With the current government, it's not going anywhere. So I can say that it will definitely happen for 2021. I would imagine even if we did have a change of government, unless it was completely out of cycle, if it went, when we anticipate the next election will be, we'll definitely be doing this again in 2024 because that would be too short term for anything to change. Beyond that, it really depends on the views of government at the time. But definitely 2021 and 2024, we're very confident we'll go ahead. So the definition of research for the purpose of this exercise is the same definition that they use for ERA. And I think that's one of the really important messages that we're trying to make sure that everyone gets is that it is about research. So this is not about all of the different ways that universities engage outside of the institutional context. It actually has to be linked back to the research. So they're not interested in our teaching programs, they're not interested in other activities that we do that are not connected to our research. Engagement is the interactions between our researchers and end users. So an end user is basically anyone who can benefit from the research who is not an academic. And that's probably the other really, really important parameter here. This process is completely not interested in any of our interactions with other universities in Australia or internationally. So they don't constitute end users. Makes it a bit tricky in some disciplines, particularly in some of the health disciplines where there's a lot of joint positions where somebody might be, co-appointed to a university and a hospital. By virtue of having that university appointment, they're not an end user for the purpose of this exercise because they're deemed to have a university appointment. But end users can be quite broad. So they might be government agencies, non-profits, commercial companies, communities, individuals. So basically anyone outside of academia who benefits from the research. And impact is the actual contribution. So how did the economy, society change as a result of the research that we did? So they're not interested in actual research study findings per se, it's what then happened. How did things actually change out there in the real world as a result of the research that you did? As I mentioned, there was a pilot in 2017 which tested a very small number of codes. We submitted in that process, and that's the codes that we submitted in. We also internally did the same process for all the codes so we could start to get a sense of what our submissions might look like. And those were our scores from the pilot. It's a 3-scale scoring system, low, medium and high. So we didn't do particularly well in the pilot. And I think we were anticipating not a lot of change from that in the 2018 submission because we were very much talking about similar reference periods. So in order to determine what goes in, there's a threshold in terms of what codes we have to submit in. So the threshold, this is all done at a 2-digit level. And the threshold is 150 weighted outputs submitted for ERA. And that's why I was saying that link to the ERA submission is really, really important. We don't get a separate opportunity to determine whether we're going to submit in a code or not. If our ERA submission contains 150 outputs at the 2-digit level, then we are required to submit. We submit engagement, which is how we're interacting with end users. We submit on the impact of our research based on a case study, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, and the approach to impact. So how did this university actually enable that impact to happen? And it's really important that those two things connect to each other. In 2018, and I imagine it will stay the same, universities did have the option of not submitting a case study if you were over threshold in a particular code, but you had a legitimate reason. Like, we've recently recruited a large number of people, or we've got lots of outputs, but we haven't yet got a sort of consolidated research profile or something we're working towards. But you then need to submit the following round, so we wouldn't be using that option this year. You can also submit if you're under threshold, so if you're a small university or a small research area, you can say, well, we don't have 150 outputs, so we only had 40, but we actually think we've had a really huge impact here, so you can actually elect to submit. There's also an option to submit a multidisciplinary case study, which in addition to the FOR codes that you're over threshold in, and also the option to submit an Indigenous, which they've just categorised Indigenous research as if it was its own FOR code, so it can be in any discipline, and it is again an optional code, so you don't submit an engagement submission but just an impact submission. A number of universities, but I would say a fairly small number of universities in the 2018 round took the option of submitting in those optional codes, and I think that's probably because nobody really knew what the benchmarks were, and so if you don't have to put something in, the risk of getting a low assessment, you're better off to sort of sit back and wait and see what everybody else does and what does well. So this is what we actually submitted in the 2018 submission. As you can see, we took the option of saying we weren't ready to submit in two codes there, which was 11A and 15. So for us, 15, that worked quite well because this year we're going to be, it looks like we'll probably be under threshold, so we won't have to submit in 15 in the next round. But we will have to submit in 11A. You'll see that 11 is the only one that actually has two submissions. All of the others are one submission per two-digit code, and that's because of
Sorry, threshold determined by number of publications?
Yes.
Or number of cases, okay.
a weighted number of publications.
Just by
So 150 weighted
Yeah.
publications at the two-digit level, you have to submit. So these are the components of the submission and the reference periods. So the engagement submission is the broadest part of the exercise because that talks about everything that all researchers in that two-digit code are doing. That is actually interacting with end users, and it's all of our activity. There's a number of numeric indicators, which I'll show you in a minute, and also a narrative statement where we talk more broadly about these are our strategies in, for example, 17 or 13. This is everything that we're doing to engage with end users and to make sure that our research gets out there. The impact case study, so for the 2018 round, it was impact that we'd had in the period 2011 to 2016. And the associated research can obviously be a long time prior to that, based on the assumption that it actually takes a long time for research to actually have that impact beyond publications. And that's a narrative, it's a case study. So it's really about putting forward a very convincing case that this research, body of research that we've done has actually had an impact on the broader society. And it has to be supported by evidence though. So they want, in all of these components, they want numbers. So we can't just say, as a result of this piece of research we did, children are happier and healthier. We need to say, this many children in this many schools have benefited and here's our data to support that. So it actually has to be demonstrated. All you submit though is the submission. You can't put in any attachments or additional evidence, you can't have web links. And the way that this was originally described was that all case studies would be published at the end of the process, and that was going to be the sort of integrity checking. That, you know, you could make up a wonderful story, but then it would be published on the internet, and your good friends and colleagues at other universities would certainly notice if you made stuff up. They actually changed that and only published the high-scoring impact case studies on their website. They didn't publish any of the approach to impact statements, and they didn't publish the engagement statements, and they didn't publish impact statements that scored low or medium. That's actually really unfortunate in terms of understanding for us, you know, what actually scored well, what didn't score well, what were they looking for, because we thought we were going to have all of that comparative information, and we don't. The reference period for approach to impact is a little bit more rubbery because it's defined by what you're putting in your case study. So it's what did the university do between the research happening and the impact that you're claiming. So, for example, if we put in a case study and we said we had all this impact in 2013, then our approach to impact could only be what have we done up to 2013. So it's really about that link between the university did these things to actually facilitate and support that impact happening. You can get very, very different scores across those different parts of the assessment, and that was probably the biggest change from the pilot. So in the pilot there were only two components. You got a score for engagement, and you got a score for impact, which included what the university does. And the feedback from that process was that often those things really varied. You could have absolutely amazing impact from a piece of research and it appeared that the university did nothing to support that. It was just luck or the work of the individual. And equally, you could have a university that was doing a huge amount, but impact hadn't happened for other reasons, and that's why they've separated it. Obviously, in an ideal world, you want those scores to be the same. Because if you scored high for impact and low for approach to impact, the sort of message that sends is, well, these people had an amazing impact despite the university that they work for, which is not the message that you want. So you really want those things to line up and line up as high as possible up the scoring scale. So in terms of the engagement submission, as I mentioned, there's actually some numeric indicators that are just taken directly from the ERA submission, so obviously we can't change those. And those are very much around income categories. So the research that the university receives that actually could be counted applied research. So it's things like linkage grants and partnership grants, money from end user organisations, so funding from government or community. It's also looking at our income per FTE and research commercialisation income, although in most universities don't have research commercialisation income. But those things are all taken from the ERA submission and they're fed back to us when we're preparing our engagement submission. So we get a portal that opens up and it says this is your data that you're now commenting on in your explanatory statement. And from the next round on, we will also be scored on our proportion of our HDR students who have a co-supervisor who's an end user. And that's not reported for ERA, that's something that's reported separately just for this process. And the idea behind that is to encourage researchers to be partnering with the people whose research is actually going to impact on to provide supervision for students.
So it's cash support from research end users, so in-kind support is not counted, is that right?
That's correct. So in the pilot they counted in kind, and what happened was the universities and the ARC were of the view that it was just impossible to count and impossible to prove. You know, cash is there, it's physical, we can count it, we can see it. So they removed that after the pilot, so it is just cash support. So there's that part of it, which is those indicators, and we write an explanatory statement that goes with that so we can clarify anything in there. But then you also write an engagement narrative, so your narrative tells that broader story of how you engage, and you can certainly talk about in-kind support there, but it's just not one of the indicator variables. So it can be a very valid part of the engagement narrative, you know, that we're working in partnership with these organisations or government departments, and you know, they provide this type of support and this type of interaction. So the engagement narrative is really about that. How do we actually interact with end users, and what's the purpose of it, that we're actually doing it for an intentional reason that relates to our research. And again, we need to actually be providing specific data. So we can't say, you know, in FOR 17 we have, you know, regular seminars that members of the community can attend. We need to say we held this many information sessions or this many seminars and these many people came. So it's really about being able to actually demonstrate that it's there. So, I mean, the main thing in the indicators that we actually have some immediate control over that we're talking to people about is that issue with the HDR students. So if there is the possibility to involve an end user as a co-supervisor on a project. That also has a beneficial outcome for the student. So it's not just about driving our scores up. Students who have supervisors that are, you know, actually working in the area that they plan to work in when they finish it, but you know, they're going to get more job opportunities, they're going to get more practical exposure and experience, so there are advantages.
That's obviously relevant to linkage grants where we've got formal industry partners, but I'm assuming that it's not limited to that.
Absolutely not limited to that. So it could be, you know, you're working, if it's a project funded through Discovery or funded in some completely other way, but there's a logical link to, you know, a community group, an end user, a government department, yeah, then you could bring on anyone who's relevant. And in our categorisation, you know, we have the different levels of supervisors. So we have supervisors, co-supervisors and associate supervisors. So these people don't necessarily have to have a PhD, but they would meet our criteria for, you know, bringing additional expertise. So that's the engagement part of it. The impact part, as I say, the primary part of this is your case study. So this is really making a very strong case for the impact that this research had on society, on the economy, on culture. How have we actually changed the world as a result of the research that's been done? And again, very clearly articulating who's benefited from the research, who are the end users, what's the nature and the type of impact, what's the extent of the impact, and again, it have to be very clear that it's within the reference period that's set for each submission. And it goes back to that, and again, same process. It's about actually being able to demonstrate numbers and reality. So, you know, people's scores on this measure have improved, or more people have been retained in the profession, or these changes. We can talk about changes to policy. So it might be, you know, changes to government policy. It might be changes to, you know, education policy. We talk about practice. So are teachers or psychologists or public servants behaving differently as a result of our research, and also the impact actually on the individuals themselves or on the communities. And it's when I say it's a research case study, it may be, depending on the nature of what you're doing, it may be a whole body of research. So it might be, you know, this is a body of research we've been working on for, you know, 5 years or 10 years, and there's a number of associated publications, or it might be one absolutely groundbreaking piece of research. You know, we had this one paper that changed the world in this particular way. But it has to link to that approach to impact. So what did the institution do to facilitate that impact? How did they actually support that research to have the impact that it had on the community? So it's a range of things that we could be providing support. So obviously, you know, the most obvious things are things like funding. So funding of positions, providing infrastructure, providing, you know, resources, providing HR support, mechanisms for actually disseminating research and involving the users of our research, making sure that our impact happened. It's done at the level of what does the research team do to support this, what does the faculty or institute do to support this, and what does the university do to support this. And as I said, it's very broad. So it might be, you know, things like HR policies that we have, or you know, leave policies, or budget that's given to people, or support from the government relations office to work with politicians, or support from the media unit to promote the work that you're doing, or support from IT in terms of building websites. So it's quite broad, but it needs to demonstrate that this was the actual support that enabled that impact to happen, that it wasn't just good luck. So as I mentioned, those were our scores in the pilot, and those were our scores in 2018. So we're actually really pleased with that. It's set us actually a pretty high benchmark, because we are above the sector average on 2 of the 3 measures, so that was quite rewarding for us. Not that it's directly relevant to people here, but one of the things we were really excited about was 21, history and archaeology. That's what we'd like them all to look like, so a consistent high, and one of only 2 universities in Australia that got a consistent high for history, so that was
The approach to impact the part that the university contributes?
Sorry?
Is the approach to impact the part that the university contributes?
Yes, so it's what did the university do to facilitate that impact?
So is that saying that psychology wasn't well supported by the university?
Those are your words, Joseph.
It says,
Yes.
I, Chris Lonsdale, want to ask this question.
All right. Chris Lonsdale over there. Chris Lonsdale over there. You know, I'm not going to reuse the words that you used, but the assessors make a determination on whether they think that the impact was at particular levels, and also whether they think that the support that the university provided was strong enough to drive that impact. Having said that, we actually did fare better than most universities on those measures, so we actually did score quite well. Not many people got a high. I think that there's 2 things that are really important here. One is around whether things happen, and the other is, do we actually record them, and do we actually know that they happened? Because these processes are so retrospective, and a lot of times we're talking about research that people have moved on, they've gone to another university, and can anyone remember what we did to support that person? Also because people move around a lot, and the impact is what happened in that period. The approach to impact is, what did this university do? So if we put a case study forward that had impact across a 6-year period, but the person was only employed here for 3 of those years, we can only claim those 3 years, so what we did. So it's not as simple as as that, but you know, in an ideal world, you'd want them all to line up nicely.
Is there any, concrete suggestions about how that low could be made medium, or what would have to change?
I do have those.
Oh,
I do have those. At the point that we did this, there was no concrete suggestions at all, because what we'd all hoped would come out of the pilot would be this nice set of guidelines that said these are the things that score well, and those who were involved in the pilot will remember that we got one sentence for each case study, which would be things like, you know, this received a low score because the committee wasn't convinced that there was impact. Didn't really, you know, help you very much. So we really went into this blind, and every university had different views on what it was going to look like, what sorts of things were going to score well. As I say, we originally anticipated that all of these would be published and we'd be able to see, but they have actually produced a report that says what they characterise as high, so I will go to that. So just so you know, those were the actual case studies that we submitted in the 2018 round. It was really difficult to find, given the historical nature of this, research that had actually happened here and impact that had been supported here, and we were still actually able to access the researchers to get that sort of data, which is why going forward we really need to be collecting this data as it happens, because you know, when we do the 2021 submission or the 2024 submission, we might be talking about research done by people who've retired or moved on, and you know, it gets harder and harder to collect that data. So as I say, for impact and approach to impact, we did actually score above the sector average. We were slightly below on engagement. As I sort of said in response to your question, there was two things. One was around the lack, in some cases there was a lack of actual impact or a lack of actual support for impact, and in a lot of cases it was just we've never collected the data. So when you go to people and you ask them about things like, you know, what support did you get from the media unit in the last 6 years, it's actually really hard to remember, you know, or what was all the funding that you get, or, you know, what travel did we support you to do. It's actually not something that people can kind of readily rattle off, particularly if they've now gone to another university, so they're not, you know, overly motivated to provide all that information. So I think that will get better as we get better at recording it. But they did provide us a handy summary of what scored well. So in terms of engagement, as you can see, some of these are very ambitious. So, you know, collaboration with industry and research partners, things like co-location on campuses, you know, that's, these are sort of really high benchmark targets. These are the things that they thought were absolutely wonderful. You know, we might not be able to build an industry platform, you know, on most of our campuses, but things like co-location, you know, can we have people from industry come and work at the university for periods of time, researchers from the university go and spend time with our partners. Things like conferences and workshops, so when we're presenting our research, to actually invite end users in to listen to those and get involved in understanding our research. University business units, they seem very keen on public participation and citizen science, so actually getting end users, members of the public involved in designing research studies, in collecting data and being involved in kind of analysing and feeding that back. We do have areas of the university that do that very well. I'm sure lots of you guys do. So when I give examples, it's not saying you don't do them, it's just I only know what we wrote in our submission last time around. So if I talk about that, you know, the citizen science stuff, if you look at some of the work Christine Innes is doing in the cerebral palsy area, a lot of her work, she actually gets people involved right at the very, very beginning who, you know, are either people with cerebral palsy or carers of people with cerebral palsy to sort of inform the research design, help them work out exactly what it is that they're going to study and position the research in a way that's really useful and helpful. So that's the sort of thing that they're looking at, is that we're not just sort of doing the research we want to do and then going out and hoping somebody wants it, but that right from the beginning we're actually making sure that we're doing research that people actually want the questions answered. Providing specialist services and resources to our external stakeholders, so that might be letting them use wonderful pieces of equipment that you've got, or it might be going out and, you know, helping them with advice, training, giving them other kinds of resources. A lot of stuff around, you know, training programs, working with end users, resourcing people. So it's really, as I say, a lot of that stuff's probably already happening, we just don't record it. I'm sure that you have you know, conferences and workshops and information sessions. You go out and you talk to your partners, you know, you go out to schools, you go out to other organisations. But we've never actually been asked to record all this information before. So, you know, if you don't record it, it's really hard to report it. Approach to impact. Lots and lots of suggestions. So a lot of these are actually quite similar to the engagement suggestions, as you can kind of imagine, because there is some overlap. The main thing there is about it being ongoing, so long-term relationships with stakeholders and end users, being able to actually report that there's a real strategy behind this. You know, we work with these particular organisations or these particular community groups or particular entities with a goal in mind, that we're actually trying to work together to solve problems. Formalised research agreements and partnerships, having those stakeholders involved in setting research directions and being involved in the university. Provision of infrastructure, so, you know, technological support, buildings, a whole range of things that we could put in there in terms of the types of things that we're doing to actually you know, support researchers to make sure that their work gets out there. A lot of stuff around knowledge transfer, so are we training people, are we mentoring people, social media, because everyone loves social media, PhD support, you know, that the issue around the co-supervision of students and PhD students being located. So it's really looking at all of those things. And I guess if I turn it around, the question that I would have for you to all think about is, if you think about the research that you're doing that's likely to have impact, what could the university do to support you? What would that look like? Are there, not just from the ODVCR, but other areas of the university? Are there things that, you know, marketing or HR or IT or government relations or mission, are there other parts of the university that could be doing things to support you? Because we're now in a really good position to get that support, because we need to actually be able to demonstrate that for these processes. Just put up there the reference periods as we understand them to be. Primarily for the point of view that, you know, I'm here talking with great enthusiasm and panic about the 2021 submission, and people are saying to me, but it's 2019, why are you worried about 2021? It's 2 years away. It's because our reference period ends in December. So when we write that up, we might not have to write it for another 2 years, but it's about the impact that we've had up until the end of this year and the support that we provide for that impact. So anything that we want to do to increase the competitiveness of those submissions, we have to do in the next 6 months. So if there are things we could be doing to increase the impact of our research, things we could be doing to increase our engagement with end users, we need to be identifying those now and doing what we can to make those happen. In terms of what my office is doing at the moment, working with the ODVCR to collate existing engagement data. So we're very lucky to have an amazing team. So Rod Lewis and Di and their team, they've been really fantastic about getting all that information for us, and what do we think the submission is going to look like. So what does our data look like going into ERA? Because that's giving us that context, which is really, really helpful. Providing information to faculties and institutes and researchers, like today, around what's the types of data that we are reporting. We're trying to identify the case studies that we want to submit in 2021 and 2024, so that we can start documenting, but also provide support. You know, in an ideal world, it'd be great to say, well, we'd like to help every researcher have more impact, and we would, but we don't have the resources to do that. We do have the resources to say, well, if we know what case studies we're looking at putting in 2021 and 2024, then our team can help work with you and say, well, what are there people we could lobby to get you additional support? Are there things that we needed? Can we set up some sort of, you know, databases or tools to help you collect that data and report it? So we really want to identify those and then start actually making sure we're doing those things. Working with our case study researchers to find out what it is that you need. You can see that I should have updated that because it should say 6 months, not 8 months. And working with the operational units. So we've already put a number of units on notice that, for example, marketing and external relations, as soon as we know what the case studies are, we're going to be coming to you saying, here, please really focus your efforts with the media on getting these stories out there. So, you know, anything you can think of that we can do that would help. So that's what we're submitting next year, as far as we know, or next round, based on our current assessment of where we're going to be over threshold, which we can be pretty close now because we've only got 6 months to go, so we know what's already in the system. And then, as I said, there's the option of submitting an Indigenous case and a multidisciplinary case, and that's really around whether research teams feel that we've got a really solid case study to put in. So what do we need from you? Obviously, for engagement, the indicators. So, if you can all race out and get lots and lots of end user money, that would be really helpful. But it's also about making sure that things are recorded correctly. So that was one of the things that came up, not just for our university, every research officer I spoke to. A lot of the ways that our systems were set up to record data, it's not always easy to identify what specifically came from end users, so making sure that that data is entered correctly. Ensuring that wherever possible we do have those end users as co-supervisors, because that's probably the one indicator that we do have some control over. And in terms of the narrative, really just encouraging and supporting researchers to engage with end users as much as possible. So that's right through from that design and planning stage. If you're writing grants, and there's people that you think would be impacted by the outcomes, get them in at the early stages. Get them to have a look at the grants that you're working on and maybe provide advice about whether those are the right sorts of research questions. But obviously that has benefits for the research as well, because it means that you've actually got them on board and you're not going to them down the track and saying, can we come and collect data from you? New ways of disseminating, so if there's anything we can do to support you or get other areas of the university to support you in bringing more end users or members of the public on campus, or helping you go out and provide information to them. And that might even be, can we tag on to other events that are happening at the university or other things that are happening and disseminate some of our research. And probably the biggest thing is just recording that stuff, so that when we come back to in 2021 and we say, how many seminars did you run in this time period and how many people came, as much as possible, if we've got that data, that would be great. For impact, obviously, suggestions for case studies. So at the moment, I think we have a pretty good idea for one of the 11s, A or B. We're not sure where it's going to sit yet, and 13, and we're still working on the others. So any suggestions for case studies? Encouraging all researchers to collect and record impact data right from the very, very beginning, because when I talk about identifying case studies, we've sort of got one eye on what case studies we want for 2021. I'm in some ways more interested in what case studies we're going to put in 2024, because those are the ones where we really do have the capacity to wrap that support around them and really maximise the impact. So when I talk about case studies, we're not just asking you what do you think has had impact up until the end of this year, but are there other things you're working on that you think, well, that's actually going to have impact in the following 3 years, and how can we make sure that we record all of that? In terms of the approach to impact, obviously it's helpful to us to know who's the best person to come to when we're pulling the submissions together, to find out what types of support, and it's all of those things, being able to get information on the number of staff and the amount of salary and the other resources that you get. And just encouraging people to record that, and other areas of the university. As I said, we're really working across the university to how can the whole institution come together to support research impact. So if there's particular things that would be useful to you, like we'd like more media stories, we'd like a website built that's got all of our research in really simple form so that schools and other communities can use it. We'd like to meet a particular politician and talk about the work. So pretty much anything you can think of that the university has capacity to do, we'd be interested in knowing how we can support you with that. And I think that's all from me.
I know one of the issues that we had when we first started talking about this and didn't know anything about what it really was, we had kind of a shotgun approach.
Yep.
And that's probably not very productive. So the number of case studies that we're going to put in is really a pretty small number. And so probably what we need to do is identify those early and then really focus on those rather than having everybody do everything.
Absolutely, yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's the key. If we could say, this is the case study that we're going to put in 2021, and let's identify 2 that are potential for 2024, because there's never guaranteed impact, but based on the research that's currently being done in the Institute, we think that these are the 2 things that are most likely to have an impact in what will be the reference period for 2024, then yes, we would very much focus our effort on that, working with those researchers, what sorts of tools would be useful for you to collect that data, what sort of support can we provide, what else do you need from other parts.
And have you identified ones for this institute for the next round?
We're working on that. I have spoken to Chris about a potential one, and we're just working out which FOR code that it would sit in. But, you know, obviously very, very open to suggestions from people if you do have case studies that you think that, you know, have significant impact in the
Because
reference
from
period.
what you're saying, it's pretty close to the deadline already, so we should.
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
in particular, I mean, I don't mind me saying, like, we need equivalent for psychology. There isn't one clearly identified right now,
Yeah.
so it's needed.
So the difficulty is it's got to be kind of situated in Australia, doesn't it? So like we have people like Rich Ryan, who a lot of the impact is overseas. Does that matter?
That's fine.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter where the impact
But
is.
is the university seen as supporting?
That's the question.
Yeah, that's.
So that's where I'm saying those 2 things have to sit together. So if we were talking about someone who's sort of got a joint appointment here and somewhere else, you could claim their impact, but to claim support for impact, we would actually have to be able to demonstrate what does ACU do that facilitates that impact. So it's not enough that we pay their salary, but what other things are we doing to help that impact happen? It doesn't have to be impact in Australia, but we have to be able to demonstrate that, you know, the university has actually contributed to it.
So they probably tend to be often situated in Australia because of that.
There are times where ERA and the impact seem to be, you have to choose one. So often we get told, don't go for these small industry grants, we should go for that. So I suppose the question is what will the implications of this process be for the way the university is funded, and from that, the way in which we'll get pressure to operate in accordance with that?
You're right, in many ways they really are in conflict with each other, because the types of things that often do have impact at the, you know, community level are the things that are not going to get published in the top international journals and get lots of citations, because we're talking about totally different processes and different audiences. At the moment the focus is very much on ERA, because that's where our funding comes from and that's where the reputation comes from. I think it will change over time. This is the first time this process has been done. Nobody really knew what the ARC was looking for. I'm not sure the ARC knew what they were looking for. And so obviously they didn't attach any funding to it or any real kudos to it. I suspect that as this continues, because this particularly now that we know we've got the same government we had before that brought it in, the view is this is how we justify to taxpayers the money that the government is spending on research. So I would believe that once this is they've actually got all of the flaws out of this and they've got it working really well and they're able to clearly articulate what they're looking for and universities are doing it, then I would imagine it will considerably increase in its importance and its contribution to our funding, because taxpayers are going to be much more interested in knowing, yes, the universities did this thing that made our life better, than yes, universities did this thing that, you know, they got lots of citations. But it's not going to be a really fast transition. But at the same time, it's one we have to be preparing for. You know, it's easier if you're a huge research university, because then you can say, well, let's have these people over here and we'll support them to have impact. And we won't worry too much about ERA and let's get, you know, we don't sort of have that luxury. So you know, what we really want to do is find ways that we can make sure that we have both. I'm not saying that's easy. Any other questions? But very, very happy to hear people's suggestions, you know, email or call with any suggestions for things that, particularly for possible case studies for 2021 or 2024, but things that we could be doing to support you to have impact or to increase engagement, or even tools that you'd like. You know, if it might be, well, we do a lot of this, but we don't have a current way of collecting that data, we can certainly help with those sorts of things.
Sandra, when are we likely to hear from the ARC whether or not case studies can be reused as long as they're continuing to have impact or having new impact?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The ARC is really not committed to anything until they issue the guidelines, and this is why the really retrospective nature of this process is tricky, because if we look at when we got the 2018 guidelines, it was well after the end of the reference period. So we have to be really careful with that, and we are following that as an option. So where we've had a case study in this round that scored really well, we will continue to write up and collect its impact data going forward, because if the guidelines come out and they say you can resubmit, and we've got something that scored high, and we know that it's continued to grow and expand and have more impact, it would be silly not to submit it again. But we won't know until those guidelines come out whether they're going to say yes you can or no you can't. And the guidelines, they're not going to come out by the end of this year.
Yeah.
So we won't know.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about, like, for something like the iPad one we talked about earlier, I mean, it's had impact. It's reasonably likely to have much bigger impact in the next 3 years. So instead of, you want to keep your powder dry and leave it for 2024, it's a bit of a strategic.
Yeah. And that's why we're trying to workshop more than one case study for each code, because we want to be able to make those sorts of decisions. We'd be silly just to focus on one for each code and then find that, you know, we thought it was going to have this huge impact, but that was delayed. It's really about saying for each code we'd like to have at least 2 that are in preparation, and then we can, as long as we're working on them now and doing everything we can to support them now, we can actually make that decision down the track. You know, we can look at them both at the end of 2020 and say, okay, which one has the most impact in that period and which one's still growing, and, you know, let's do this one 2021, this one 2024.
Thinking about our institute and anything that comes around the engagement and impact is typically supported by either exceptional professional staff or a lot of our early career researchers. And I wonder, is there a case where ACU will be committing money to supporting those ECRs and professional staff that do a lot of the backbreaking work around impact and engagement?
I can't speak for exactly what the university is going to do. I would say I've seen some very encouraging signs. I would say some of the recent announcements I've seen around positioning of different areas of interest in the university and the announcement of new positions has suggested to me that that is happening. Just last week they announced the new Pro-Vice Chancellor Academic Culture. I think that really, if you look at the announcement that came out, that is really about, you know, promoting that and making sure that even if people are not doing things that are sort of in that era area, that there's still real academic rigour and scholarship to the work that they're doing, and that those things are supported. I think the renaming of SATCO's position to be education and innovation, and declaring a number of things innovation areas so that they'll get focus. I think that the university is really seeing that those things need to happen, and I'm quite optimistic. I can't say specifically this will happen for these people or these units, but I think there's very, very clear signs that there's a recognition that those things need to be valued and encouraged.
If the university really wants to take this seriously, then particularly in the institutes, there should be somebody in each institute that's sort of responsible for overseeing that. And that's a funding kind of issue. I mean, it's not quite what Phil was saying, but it's related to that.
If I had control over the budget, I'd like to see that. I'd like to see a role like that in every institute and every faculty, because I think if you had somebody in each group of researchers that really understood what was being asked for and could support people to do that. I mean, I have a team in the research engagement area. I have a team of 2 people, and this is a very big university, so there's not, you know, there's a limit.
No, I wasn't trying to target you.
No, I didn't think you were. I'm saying yes, absolutely. If the money was there, if I had control over allocation of budget, that would be the number one thing on my wish list, would be that each institute and faculty has somebody who's specifically tasked with that.
And realistically, that's going to be a function of how important this is seen to be and what's tied to it.
Yeah. And as I say, I think because we've only had the one round and we haven't seen any real impact from that yet, that it will change over time.